Hello and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we will be going over what I would recommend are the top 5 pet reptiles best suited for beginners. We will be scoring each species based on their availability, affordability, ease of feeding, ease of handling, and their overall behavior. So if you're looking for your first pet reptile, this video can give you an all-round idea on what you could go for as your first pet reptile. You'll also have a better idea on which species would suit your living circumstances better, so you can make the most out of being a reptile keeper. So for each species, obviously, like I mentioned, we're going to be scoring them based on different aspects. And for each aspect, we're going to give them a score out of 0 to 5. 0 is going to be the worst and 5 is going to be the best. So let's dive into this video, shall we? Number 1, bearded dragons. The bearded dragon is an amazing species which are perfect for beginners. They have amazing, lovely personalities and they are extremely curious and fascinating to watch. They are also probably the best pet reptile option for kids because beardies are quite hardy and robust. Bearded dragons make a great option for those looking for some hands-on experience because they're very straightforward to handle, and obviously once they're actually in your hand, as you can see, they're pretty calm. A lot of people will simply just put their beardie on their shoulder and they'll just sit there for like hours on end. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have a kid which is a bit heavy-handed, this is probably your best option in my opinion because they are very robust and they're not as fragile as something like a gecko, if that makes sense. But as far as handling goes, bearded dragons make one of the best options in my opinion, and you will have a lot of fun handling them. So for this reason, I am going to rate the bearded dragon a 5 on handling. So now let's rate them on their availability. They are extremely easy to get hold of. Most reptile shops will stock bearded dragons because of how popular they are. So you're not going to have any issues trying to actually get one for yourself. So for this reason, we're going to be scoring them a 5 out of 5. Moving on to their affordability. Now, I will mention that they are probably the more expensive species out of the 5 that we're going to go over today. However, once obviously you've bought this setup, they are fairly inexpensive to actually upkeep. Their heating and lighting is pretty inexpensive. And to maintain their setup, the only real things that you're going to need to buy is new substrate every few months and obviously replace their UVB tube once a year. In addition to this, obviously you're going to need to purchase calcium and multivitamin as and when it runs out, as well as purchase live food which you are wanting to feed. So if we combine all of this together, we will give them a score of 2 out of 5 for affordability because obviously their upfront setup cost is more expensive. Now for their feeding, they do require a bit more of a specialised diet than other species we're going over. Their diet is 80% vegetation in the form of greens like rocket and watercress, as well as 20% live food in the form of things like locusts, crickets and roaches and worms. All their food needs to be supplemented in calcium and multivitamin. Now, I will mention that beardies can be fussy when it comes down to eating veg, and it's usually because you're feeding too many live foods. So just make sure that you're always offering more veg than live food, but you really do just need to be persistent with it, as well as being careful that you're not overfeeding on live food. That being said, they are great eaters. They do love their food. So for all of these reasons combined, we're going to rate them a 3 out of 5 for feeding. So now let's rate them on their overall behaviour. I'm going to give them a solid 5 out of 5 for this one because they are highly active and fun to interact with, great for handling, and they are extremely docile as pets. All beardies have their own personalities and their own characteristics, which just make them a wonderful pet to have. So overall, the bearded dragon scored a total of 20 points out of 25 points. So now let's move on to the next one. Number 2, Leopard Gecko. Leopard geckos are a great option for beginners because of how docile they are and how easy they are to care for. They're very forgiving when things aren't done correctly. These geckos are just adorable and are always smiling. So to begin with, we're going to rate them on their handling. We would rate them a 4 out of 5 because you have to be a lot slower and calmer than handling a bearded dragon, for example. These geckos don't like being grabbed from above and are a lot more fragile than bearded dragons. But once they're actually in your hand, they are usually pretty calm and they do like a good handling session. The key to handling these geckos is to let them climb onto you at their own pace. The calmer you are, the calmer they will be. If you do grab them from above, it can result in stressing your gecko out, and it can also drop its tail as a result. So for all these reasons combined, we will be giving them a 4 out of 5 for their handling. As for the availability scoring, we will be giving them a 5 because, again, these are extremely easy to get hold of because most reptile shops will stock them because of how great they are for beginners and how popular they are. So you're not going to have a problem trying to get hold of a leopard gecko for yourself, which is why we're going to give them a 5 out of 5 for this. Now let's talk about their affordability. Now, these leopard geckos are a lot cheaper than a bearded dragon. Their upfront setup cost is cheaper than a bearded dragon. The heating and lighting cost is also cheaper per month than a bearded dragon. But one of the main reasons why I believe these geckos make a great option for new keepers is because they require a lot smaller of a vivarium than a bearded dragon would, for example. So if you're limited on what space you have available for a setup, a leopard gecko could be a great option for you. The main things that you're going to need to buy throughout the year is obviously calcium and multivitamin. You also need to change the substrate every so often, as well as change the UVB tube once a year. In addition to that, obviously you're going to need to buy live food because they are purely insectivores. So because they're so cheap to maintain, we're going to rate them a solid 5 out of 5 for this one. So now we're going to rate them on their feeding. These geckos are insectivores, so they will only eat the live insects, which means you will need to purchase this so you'll be able to feed them. They are usually very good eaters. However, that being said, they are notoriously known to become bored of one type of live food, so we suggest that you always switch up what you are offering to them. This provides them a diverse diet, but also it keeps them interested in their food. So we're going to rate these leopard geckos a 4 out of 5 on feeding. You will have lots of fun watching your leopard gecko trying to catch its food, as well as feeding them from the tongs. Now, for their overall behaviour, we would rate them as a 4 out of 5 because they are calm and docile, and obviously they're very straightforward to care for and forgiving when things aren't correct. However, obviously they do drop their tails, and once this has been dropped, they do regrow a small stub, but it will never be the same as before. Another thing to do with these leopard geckos is that obviously they're mainly awake during dusk and dawn. So if you're looking for something that's more active during the day, then this might not be the correct reptile for you. That being said though, they do come out during the daytime, but it's just not as often, and you will notice that they'll be more active during the nighttime. So for these reasons, that is why we're going to be giving them a 4. Now, overall, the leopard gecko scored a total of 22 out of 25. So now let's move on to option 3. Number 3, crested or gargoyle gecko. Crested and gargoyle geckos are fairly similar regarding their care and setup. I will say though that crested geckos are a little bit easier to look after than gargoyle geckos, but they both do make great options for beginners in my opinion. They are extremely cute, great fun to watch and interact with. So to begin with, we're going to rate them on their handling. Now, crested geckos and gargoyle geckos both do drop their tails as a defense mechanism. Now, crested geckos will regrow a small stub, and gargoyle geckos will actually fully regenerate their tail. They also don't really like being grabbed from above. This can usually stress them out and will obviously result in a tail drop. Now, I will say that crested geckos and gargoyle geckos do like to jump. So if you're looking for a lizard that doesn't jump as much, a leopard gecko is probably a better option for you. That being said though, once they're actually in your hand, they are pretty calm, and if you can deal with the jumping, they do make great pets. The key with these geckos, again, is to stay calm and let them climb onto you at their own pace. The calmer you are, the calmer your gecko will also be. Now, personally, I find that the baby crested and gargoyle geckos tend to be a lot more jumpy than adult geckos. That being said, obviously the adults will jump. Obviously, you've just seen this little fella jump. But if you want something that you can have some hands-on experience with, these geckos do love a good handling session, and they will chill out eventually and just sit calmly on your hand. They are really fun to handle, and as long as you keep one hand in front of the other, they usually will just climb across your hands, just like so. They make a great option for someone who does want a hands-on experienced lizard, but doesn't want something big like a bearded dragon. So overall, I am going to rate the crested gecko and gargoyle gecko a 3 out of 5 for handling, because of those reasons which we've just gone over. So now let's move on to their availability. Now, crested geckos and gargoyle geckos are extremely easy to get hold of. They are usually always in stock in most reptile shops because of how popular they are as pets. So again, for their availability, we're going to score them a solid 5 out of 5 for this. Now, moving on to their affordability, these geckos are pretty cheap to set up front and also cheap to maintain. Their heating and lighting won't use up much electric, so it's very cheap each month. These geckos are pretty cheap to feed. You'll mainly be buying fruit mix supplements, and usually a packet of gecko diet can last you a few months before you actually need to go and buy another packet. On top of that, obviously, you'll have the occasional expense of live food, but live food's really not that expensive. So for the feeding costs, it's going to be kept quite low. So personally, I'm going to rate the crested and gargoyle geckos a 5 out of 5 for their affordability. So moving on to their feeding score, personally I would score them a solid 5 out of 5 for this, because 80% of their diet will be commercially prepared gecko powder diets, and all you'll have to do is mix the powder with water and simply place it into the enclosure. So obviously it can't really get much easier than that. Now, you can actually use a chopstick to hand feed them the fruit mix, and for the other 20% of their diet, it would actually consist of feeding live food, things like crickets, locusts, mealworms, things like that. I will say that I do get a lot of customers tell me that they've never actually fed their crested gecko or gargoyle gecko live food. Personally, I would actually recommend that you do so, purely because these geckos are opportunists, which means that they will go for live food if it is offered to them. In addition to that, obviously live food has a lot of proteins and fats in it, which your gecko would obviously miss out on if it's not being fed it. So in my opinion, I do believe it's important that you do at least offer live food to your crested and gargoyle geckos. Now, the gecko that you can currently see on the screen is a gargoyle gecko. Obviously, all of the geckos that you've just seen prior to this gecko were crested geckos, but I thought I'd include a little video of a gargoyle gecko so you can see the difference. Now, moving on to their overall behaviour, I will say that these geckos tend to be quite docile. They're very straightforward to obviously care for, which is why they're a great option for beginners. They're also very forgiving when their conditions aren't actually correct. But all in all, I do find that these geckos usually have great personalities, and they are very fun to actually sit and watch. I will quickly mention that there is a little bit more daily care with these geckos than a leopard gecko or like a bearded dragon. Obviously, you need to mist down the enclosure each day with these guys just to keep that humidity level up. So personally, I'm going to rate them a 4 out of 5 on their behaviour. Now, I've rated them a 4 because obviously they do jump, and this tends to put some people off of the crested and gargoyle geckos. But in my opinion, they are one of the best pet reptiles for beginners. So in total, the crested and gargoyle geckos scored a whopping 22 out of 25 points. So now let's move on to option 4. Number 4, corn snakes. Corn snakes are a great option for those who are looking into getting their first pet reptile, especially if you're looking into getting a snake. They make great pets because they are fairly straightforward to care for and are fairly docile. Another reason why, in my opinion, they're a great option as a first pet is because they are very active and they do spend a lot of time out in the open with inside their enclosure. So to begin with, let's rate them based on their ease of feeding. Now, corn snakes are exceptionally good eaters. They very rarely will actually turn down their food, and usually if you offer them food, they will be more than happy to eat. So obviously this makes a great option for beginners because it's unlikely you'll have a problem trying to get them to actually eat. Now, baby and juvenile corn snakes only need to be fed once a week, and once they become sub-adult to adult size, you can move their feed into every 2 to 3 weeks, which means that their food is going to be fairly cheap each month. So personally, I'm going to give them a score of 5 on this because of how easy it is to actually get them to feed. Moving on to handleability, corn snakes are a great option for those looking for some hands-on experience. They are great for handling and are very fun to handle. Now, I will mention that corn snakes are very curious, and when they are being handled, they do become quite wriggly, but this is usually because they are extremely adventurous and they want to explore because of how curious they are. So as long as you let them move freely between your hands and simply place your other hand in front of your other hand whilst they're moving through your hands, you should be fine and you should be able to handle them with very little problems. As long as they can move freely, they will be very happy to be handled and also love the handling interaction. And if you're wearing long sleeve t-shirts or jackets, they do love to disappear up the sleeves. So for handling, we will be rating them a 4 out of 5 because they are quite wriggly, but they are a great option for those who are wanting that hands-on experience. And they're also a great option for kids that want hands-on experience with snakes too. So moving on to their availability, corn snakes are very widely available. Most reptile shops will sell them, because they're very good for beginners, but they are a very popular pet. So for availability, we're going to score them a 5 out of 5 because I know you won't have any problems trying to get hold of one for yourself. Now, for their affordability, in my opinion, they aren't expensive to set up front. Corn snakes are one of the cheapest snakes to set up, but once you have this setup all sorted, your only real expenses will mainly be food each week or 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the size of your snake, and also substrate every so often. Another thing to keep in mind is obviously if you have a UVB tube, then you're going to need to replace that every 8 to 12 months, depending on how much life is in it. But their heating and lighting is fairly cheap every month, so in my opinion, they are an extremely affordable pet to have and are very cheap to maintain. So I'm going to rate them a 4 out of 5 because their upfront setup is a little bit more than like a crested gecko or a leopard gecko, but they are still very cheap to run and maintain. So last of all, let's rate them on their overall behaviour. Now, corn snakes are very curious, very active, they can move quite quickly, very food orientated, they love climbing and they are highly adventurous. However, there is one thing to keep in mind. They can become viv defensive, and usually this happens when you only feed inside the enclosure. If they associate food with their enclosure, they can become defensive as a result, and they will keep striking at you every time you go in the enclosure just to clean or change the water bowl, purely because they think that they're getting fed each and every time. So to avoid this or get around this, simply just remove the snake when you want to feed, and always try to feed it outside the enclosure so it doesn't associate the vivarium with their food. This usually prevents the defensive behavior from happening. So all in all, we're going to rate them a 4 out of 5 for their overall behavior, purely because of this reason. Like I say though, usually they are fairly calm and docile, and they do make great pets, but just try to avoid this simple mistake. So altogether, the corn snake scored a whopping 22 out of 25 points. So now let's move on to option 5. Number 5, Royal Python. Royal pythons make a great option for those looking into getting their first pet snake. They are extremely docile, easy to care for, and have wonderful, calm personalities. So for their ease of feeding, they can be a bit more temperamental. I find that during breeding season, males tend to stop eating for a period of time. And if their enclosure conditions aren't correct, it can result in your python refusing to eat. They usually are good eaters though, but not as good as a corn snake, for example. So for this reason, we will be rating them a 3 out of 5 for feeding, because they can be more tricky to get feeding. That being said though, for the majority of the time, they will go for their food if it is offered to them. And they can be fun to watch strike at their food, as well as actually watch them eat. But obviously they can be a bit of a pain in the ass to get feeding from time to time. So if you don't want a snake that you may have feeding problems with, a corn snake would probably be a better option for you. But like I say, if they are feeding, they usually are fine. Moving on to their availability, again, these snakes are widely available in lots of different morphs, which is their colours and patterns, in most reptile shops. So you're not going to have an issue trying to get yourself one. So we will rate them a solid 5 out of 5 for availability. Now let's talk about their affordability. Now, pythons require a bigger setup in the long run when they are actually an adult, but you can actually buy their forever home from day one, even when they're a baby. They will make use of all of the space which you are providing. This will obviously save money on upsizing the enclosure later on down the line when they actually grow. So I'd highly recommend that you just buy the full size enclosure from day one. Their setup cost isn't too expensive, but it is a little bit more expensive than a corn snake. Again, for their maintenance cost, you'll only really be changing substrate, buying rodents, and changing UVB. So this is fairly inexpensive, and their heating and lighting doesn't cost much each month. We will actually be doing a video soon where we will break down all of the running costs and setup costs for each species that we have recommended in this video. So keep your eyes open for that video, which will be coming soon. But all in all, once you have their setup sorted, they are fairly cheap to run and maintain. So we will rate them a 3 out of 5 because they are a little more pricey than a corn snake. Moving on to handling, these guys love a good handling session, and you will have a lot of fun handling them and interacting with them. They are extremely calm and docile. They do love to explore, and they love to stretch out whilst being handled. So for handling, we will give them a 5 out of 5 because in my opinion, they are one of the best snakes to get hands-on experience with. Last of all, we will rate them on their behaviour. Now, these guys are primarily nocturnal, so they are mostly active during the night. It's less likely you'll see them during the daytime. If you want a snake which is more active during the day, though, a corn snake may be a better alternative for you. That being said, though, pythons do come out during the daytime to bask and also taking UVB, so you will see them from time to time during the day, but not as much as something like a corn snake. Other than that, as I've mentioned already, they usually are pretty calm, docile, slow movers, and very curious. So they do make a great option for those looking to get their first pet reptile. So we shall rate them a 3 out of 5 because they tend to be less active than corn snakes. Altogether, the python scored a total of 19 out of 25 points. So that's pretty much it for today's video, guys. I hope you have a better idea of what species you could decide to go for as your first pet reptile. And hopefully you have a better idea of which species would best suit your living circumstances or what you're actually looking for. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you've learned something from it. If you did like this video, please feel free to drop us a like and also let us know what you thought in the comments below. Also, maybe consider subscribing to our channel. We have a lot of content lined up for the future, so we're very keen to share a lot more knowledge with you. But yeah, thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. See ya!